this computer right now. Okay, guys, once again, a very warm welcome to our third Spirit Educational Month for the month of February. Today, we are joined by Matt Guest, who's representing the Diageo Bar Academy, to give us an insight and talk through Johnnie Walker and Tanqueray, which are two of our must-stock lines from a gin and a whiskey perspective. So without further ado, I am going to hand over to Matt. Just want to highlight once again, just like the last two sessions, please make sure if you've got any questions, you pop them on the chat, and we will make time to answer those questions at the end of the call. But please pop any questions on the chat and we will answer them at the end. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Richard. Hi, everyone. It's really good to see so many people with their camera on. It's much easier talking to smiling faces or nodding heads than it is to just a room of text. So yeah, welcome everyone. My name is Matt Guest. I've worked as an educator for about 15 years. I've worked in hospitality for going on 30. I know that I don't look it, or maybe I do. Maybe there's a little bit of grey coming through now on my beard. So I have the pleasure today to talk to you about two of my favourite brands, Tanqueray and Johnnie Walker. And obviously I can see that some people have got glassware out, maybe you're ready to taste. Potentially, that'd be great if you are. So we'll obviously go in the order of Tanqueray first and then Johnnie Walker. Otherwise, the Tanqueray will taste like Johnnie Walker. So we'll start with Tanqueray. I'm also conscious of time as well, so I'm not gonna waffle too much. I'm gonna get straight to it, if that's okay with everyone. So to start with, then let's start with Tanqueray. As you can see from my background, that's the brand that we're going to focus on first. And it doesn't work for me to get into Tanqueray's story without first just establishing a little bit of the world of gin. Now, I'm not going to go through distillation or anything like that, but just out of interest, and again, use the chat if anyone knows, what happened in 1820 that transformed gin? Something happened in 1820 and it transformed gin. No one's written anything yet. I'll give you a clue. The inventor was a guy called Aeneas Coffey. That's quite a big clue. I'm gonna assume some of you know. Oh, hey, oh, not copper still, nearly Leo. The other one, the other still, the column still. So copper stills have been around for a long time. So if you think about something like Gordon's has been around since 1768. So actually, before the invention of the column still, Gordon's would have been very, very different. It would have been more like the kind of product that you would get from Holland, Geneva, kind of like the product that kind of leads into gin. But where Tanqueray comes along, Tanqueray is 1830, and it's the first gin that really capitalizes on this new technology, this fractional style of distillation, which gives you a much lighter and much cleaner base spirit, a much cleaner canvas, if you like, because a white spirit made through a pot will inevitably carry an absolute ton of flavor with it. It's like a Pusheen in a way. Whereas actually, using a column still, you end up with neutral spirit, which then lets the botanicals shine. So that was really the kind of step change that Tanqueray made. And then obviously everyone then followed suit. So that's kind of Tanqueray's place in history. There are also, and it's probably just worth mentioning, there's three types of gin. Yeah, there's what you'd find on the bottom shelf of a supermarket. It literally says gin on the label. That is neutral spirit made in a column, and it's got some gin flavorings added. That's why it's cheap. Yeah. Then you've got London dry gin, of which obviously Tanqueray. Oh, can you see me? Tanqueray, there you go. Tanqueray is a London dry gin. London dry gin means neutral spirit made in a column, transferred to a pot, a copper pot still, and the botanicals are redistilled within the pot. I'll talk about Tanqueray's botanicals in a sec. So I think the law says distilled in the presence of botanicals. Okay, and you can't add anything afterwards. You can add a minute amount of sugar and you can dilute it with water, but you can't add anything afterwards. Okay, that as a style is London Dry Gin, of which Tanqueray is an absolute classic representation of it. Then you've got distilled gins. So I see a few of you have got Tanqueray number 10 on your table. That's right. So Tanqueray 10, if you look on that label, it will say distilled gin. What that means is it follows all the rules of a London Dry, but then it has something added afterwards. A flavouring, usually. Yeah, a flavouring's been added afterwards. There's no better or worse here, by the way. I wouldn't put London Dry on a pedestal above distilled. It really depends on the product itself, which I'll talk about in a sec. So hopefully, maybe you knew a lot of that already. If not, hopefully that was useful. Let me come back to the botanicals then on Tanqueray. So whilst there's definitely been the trend towards more and more botanicals, if you go back and you look at classic styles, what you'll find is actually they're quite simple. They're quite simple and quite straightforward. So the botanicals on Tanqueray are super easy to remember because there's 4. Okay. Just out of interest, does anyone know what the 4 are? You can use chat or you can shout out if you feel brave. Someone could have got away with just shouting out Juniper there, couldn't they?
What is it?
Oh, go on, go on.
Come on, sing.
Juniper berries.
Very good, yes. Anything else? Okay, I'll give them to you. They're super easy to remember. I'll give you the ones for Tanqueray first, and then I'll talk about Tank 10. So for Tanqueray, it's juniper, coriander, angelica, and licorice. And I'll explain what they all do. So obviously, juniper brings the ginniness. Ginny is not a word, but I'm sure you know what I mean. And actually within Tanqueray, they use an absolute bucket load. If you look at proportional recipes, if you look at a recipe with a more modern style of gin, a gin that kind of was invented more recently, the amount of juniper that they use within Tanqueray is very, very high. There aren't many that are higher, really. Then you've got coriander seed. If you've ever had the pleasure of having coriander seed, if you bust it in your fingers and smell it, it smells like citrus fruit. It smells like lemons, limes, or oranges. And that really depends on how long you keep it for. So really fresh coriander seed smells like lemons. If you keep it in Hessian sacks and you let it kind of mature, then it gradually goes more lime-like and eventually becomes a bit more like orange. And that's coriander seed, okay? Angelica is like a really big daisy, but we don't use the flower, we use the root. That binds the flavors together. And then licorice, which you might detect on the nose, for those of you that aren't from Yorkshire, you might detect it on your nose. If it's much more likely that you'll get it on your palate. Almost like a creaminess, a sweetness that's left over. I mean, it's not sweet, it's super dry, but the kind of the illusion of sweetness. So that's Tanqueray, yeah, in terms of botanicals. It's worth just saying, obviously, well, you may or may not know, but Tanqueray is part of Diageo, obviously, and there's a big stable of gins within Diageo, Gordon's being one of them. So when it comes to buying ingredients, when it comes to buying juniper, the relationships that Diageo have with a lot of the farms that they buy from have existed for literally hundreds of years. And they, to a certain extent, get first pick. because of the volume that they buy. And believe it or not, this is true. And I've been to the distillery. I've seen it happen. I've seen them doing the sorting. They will take delivery of juniper. They'll take samples from each batch. They've got like a little lab where they'll do very small distillations of just the juniper. And then they test it for the active compound that gives it the aroma that they want. And there's a level which they won't accept juniper of anything below. And they actually send back 9 out of 10 batches. So it's only 10% of what they buy is actually used. The rest is sent back to sell to the back to the open market. It's one of those areas where bigger is better, if that makes sense. And I know we talk about boutique brands, and I'm not taking anything away from anyone else, but there are some advantages sometimes of being big. And that for me is a really good example of one where juniper is incredibly important, consistency is incredibly important. So actually having that rigor behind that ingredient that's coming in from the farms, which will fluctuate from year to year, having that rigor is something that you can do if you're larger. Now, that 10% that's chosen, the top 1% is creamed off that, and that's what's used for Tanqueray. And then the other 9% goes to Gordon's. So it literally is the best. It comes from Tuscany. It's all picked by hand. I mean, it's all picked by hand in the hills. They only pick, I couldn't tell you the actual altitude, but it's pretty high in the hills and you can't get machinery there. So it's still all picked by hand in Tuscany. And like I've said, it's only the top 10% that's actually creamed off and used. So does anyone have any questions about that at all? If you do, pop them in chat and I'll answer them. So let's have a little taste then. So I know a few of you have got these open already. This is Tanqueray. I'm tasting Tanqueray London Dry here, and you'll notice from the nose that it's super punchy and the juniper's right up front. The citrus, which obviously doesn't come from citrus fruit, it comes from the coriander seed, that sits just underneath. And I'll be honest, there's a hint of licorice, but it's not super prominent. And I don't know if you get this, but there's another descriptor that you can use here, which will be fresh. I don't know if you get that. There's like a freshness. That actually, like when you use amazing juniper grows on what looks like a Christmas tree, doesn't it? So pine, smell of pine, you can often get with incredibly good juniper. And again, if you get the opportunity to visit a distillery and you get to kind of put your hands in the Hessian sacks and pick up the juniper and smell it, they'll do an example with you where they'll show you like not so good juniper, and you pick up these big handfuls and you smell it, and then you pick up great juniper, and the real difference is the smell of pine. So the good juniper smells like pine, and I think you get a hint of pine off that as well, almost like Christmas tree like. Okay, have a little taste. Feel free to dilute if you need to, bring down the ABV. Obviously, if it's the first taste that you've had today, I know it's Friday, it is 4 o'clock, so it might not be. Obviously, the first taste is always the hottest. So if it is your first taste, have a taste, mouthwash it, and then go back for a second. The second taste will always be much softer. It's bottled at 43.1. And then just very quickly, Charles Tanqueray. So he did two things before he made gin. He was a clergyman, so he's a man of the cloth. And he made silverware, he made cutlery. And obviously he got this idea when he heard about the coffee still, that there was this opportunity to create a new style, and he changed kind of direction again. But there's a couple of things that kind of like hang over. So on all Tanqueray bottles, you'll find these little silver cues. You see it around the neck. They're all cues back to the fact that Charles Tanqueray was a silversmith at one point. The crest, you know, this crest here, that was the crest that he stamped all his cutlery with. So again, on every bottle of Tanqueray, you'll always find the crest on every bottle. It doesn't matter, you know, whether it's Tanqueray, Tank 10, or one of the other variants that they have. You'll always find the crest on there. And then right on the lid, so for you guys with pour spouts, you might not be able to see this, but right on the lid, their coat of arms, their family coat of arms is a pineapple. Now, if you've been in hospitality long enough, you'll know that the pineapple is a bit of a sign of hospitality, full stop. Interestingly, the distillery used to be in Bloomsbury in London. And if you walk down the streets in Bloomsbury, where the distillery and where Charles used to live, you'll see on the end of gateposts, you'll see pineapples. And it was because they were this kind of big sign of hospitality. They were welcoming. That all comes from the fact that in the early 1800s, basically pineapples first started to become available, and very rich Londoners went crazy for them, and they would buy them as table decoration. The equivalent cost of a pineapple in Charles Tanqueray's time was about £5,000. So people would buy this £5,000 pineapple. They would have it on their table. They'd invite people round. They'd have a dinner party. They would kind of like show off their wealth. And then they would rent it out to their friends when they had dinner parties, and they'd have the pineapple on their table. No one ate the bloody pineapple. Everyone just sat around it and ate. But the pineapple coat of arms that is on top of every bottle of Tanqueray is kind of hinting back towards that kind of luxury, a little bit of decadence, but certainly that idea of hospitality as well. Now the distillery is not in Bloomsbury anymore. There's a brilliant picture. You can Google it. There's a brilliant picture of the distillery where the whole distillery is destroyed in the Second World War because it got bombed. But Old Tom, the pot still that they do that final distillation in, is literally just standing there untouched amongst the sea of rubble. So they took it up to Scotland because they were worried that the still, because the still is the original still back from 1830. They were worried that it would get destroyed, so it lives in Scotland now. And again, it's the same still that was used way back in Charles's time. So hopefully that's a good little kind of brief history of Tanqueray. Just very quickly on Tank 10. So Tanqueray 10 is really simple to understand. It is Tanqueray, but imagine we make Tanqueray and we set it aside. And then we get this very small still. It's an experimental still. It's probably, it's less than 5 foot high. I mean, it's very, very small for a commercial still. And in there, they put neutral spirit at about 60% ABV, and they squeeze in fresh Californian pink grapefruit, orange, lime, and fresh chamomile, all fresh. Now, up until that point, if you were to speak to a distiller about distilling fresh fruit, they would laugh at you, because what happens if you distill fresh fruit is it turns jammy. You lose the freshness. So the 10 on Tanqueray 10 is the amount of different shapes of experimental stills it took to get to a still shape that would work to distill fresh fruit. So Tanqueray number 10 is named after the still. The still's called Tiny 10, but there was a Tiny 1, a Tiny 2, a Tiny 3. They didn't work. Tiny 10 it's a very odd shape. It's got a really unusual swan neck. And they use that to distill fresh fruit. What essentially they end up with coming out of that is not gin. There's no juniper in it. They've made a fresh fruit distillate, and then they blend that into Tanqueray. That's why Tanqueray number 10 is a distilled gin. because a flavouring is added afterwards. It's just that flavouring is absolutely amazing. If you do ever get a chance to go up to the distillery, they let you try the fruit distillate on its own, and it's amazing on its own. But that's the thing that's then blended into Tank. Make sense? Give us a nod if that all makes sense. Yep. Cool. Okay. Well, let's move on then. Let's move on and let's talk about Johnnie Walker. Now I'm going to break it up a little bit, and I'm going to play you a video that's going to do a better job than I could do on giving you a little bit more of the very rich history of Johnnie Walker. So just bear with me one sec.
Shut it. Here's a true story about a young lad named John. Just a local farm boy, but with something special about the lad. A glint in his eye, a fire in his belly, a spring in his step. And one day, he went for a walk. Now this walk began when his father died. The year was 1819, and he was just 14 years old. Bereavement counselling. Well, these were the days when young boys were sent into the fields. The mills, the mines, tough times. But young John was smart enough to be lucky. His father's farm, where he was born and raised, was sold, and the proceeds used to open a grocer's. Big responsibility for the wee lad. His own shop in Kilmarnock, with his name on the door, John Walker, or Johnnie, as the world now knows him. Back then, all grocers stocked a range of local single malts, but they could be a wee bit inconsistent. For John, that wasn't good enough. He began blending different malts together as a way of offering his customers a consistent, unique product. Now this backroom art quickly developed into a commercial proposition, and a very profitable one. And because there's nothing like a commercial proposition to stir the Scottish heart, it grew quickly into an industry filled with ambitious entrepreneur distillers. John thrived in this environment, and so too soon with his sons, Robert and Alexander, who joined him on his journey. The Walkers became the biggest name in a rapidly growing industry. They were unstoppable. In one bold bit of 19th century corporate raiding, they bought the famed distillery at Cardew, lock, stock and ensuring their supply of this silky single malt, and guaranteeing, more importantly, that none of the other big blenders could get their hands on it. But young Alexander wasn't content with being Scotland's biggest blender. Not ambitious enough for him, no. He convinced the ship's captains of Glasgow to act as agents for him, and drove the whisky bearing his father's name across the globe. By 1860, he had developed the square bottle. Now, with a label at an angle of precisely 24 degrees. No big deal, you might think, but you'd be wrong. The square bottle meant less breakages and more bottles per ship. The diagonal label meant larger type, and together that meant Johnnie Walker had unmistakable presence on any shelf in the world. The bottle became an icon, and the rich liquid it contained sought after and consumed across the globe. Quite a character, Alexander Walker. Master of the blender's art. Ambitious, uncompromising. Mr. Walker. It was John's grandsons, George and Alexander II's turn to join him on his journey. They led the brand into the 20th century. By 1909, they had developed the iconic red label and black label, and persuaded Tom Brown, the best young illustrator of the day, to sketch a striding man in a napkin during a business lunch. In the stroke of a pen, the Victorian grocer was transformed into an Edwardian dandy. By 1920, Johnnie's walk had taken him through 120 countries, and he continued walking through the brand's advertising over the next 50 years, into the fabric of global culture, deep into the dark hearts of several wars, to the pleasure palaces of the aristocracy, immortalised by screen legends, celebrated by filmmakers, singers, songwriters, novelists, shoulder to shoulder with the great sportsmen of the age, winning countless international awards for quality and even being awarded the Royal Warrant by King George V. No going back after that. Not that going back would even have occurred to Johnnie or any of his family. By the end of the 20th century, the familiar red label and black label were joined by the green label, the gold label, and the grandest of them all, Johnnie Walker Blue Label. By the beginning of the 21st century, Johnnie Walker wasn't just the world's biggest whiskey brand, but an international symbol of progress. The brand's keep walking mantra, adopted by pro-democracy protesters and parliamentary speechwriters. What would the farm-born Victorian grocer have thought of all of this? He'd have loved it. A Victorian farm-born grocer he might have been, but he and the family that followed him were possessed by a fiery ambition with the skill and intelligence to match. 200 years later, and Johnnie Walker's still walking, and he's not showing any signs of stopping.
So hopefully you enjoyed that, and hopefully you got some kind of interesting facts from it. Interestingly, when Robert Carlyle was filming that, he could not, because I'm sure you noticed it's all done in one shot, but he could not get it right, and apparently he went off, had a few drinks, came back, and he just absolutely nailed it, all in one go. There's a few things in there I just want to kind of pick out before we get into tasting Johnnie Walker. The first one is the fact that I bartended in the UK for a long time, and actually I would say, out of all the brands that I work on, Johnnie Walker is the one that is probably the least appreciated. And if you've worked anywhere else in the world, you'll know what I mean. Because if you travel to the Middle East, if you travel to the States, if you travel pretty much anywhere else apart from the UK, Johnnie Walker as a brand occupies this kind of real, has this real luxury status to it. And I think it's a shame sometimes. I mean, Diageo haven't really focused on it over the past 30, 40 years. I think they are doing now, which excites me, because it actually, out of all the brands that they have, Johnnie Walker is the one that is a real brand. Robert Carlyle alluded to a few things around, almost standing shoulder to shoulder with parliamentary speechwriters, and the keep walking mantra being used by pro-democracy people. Like there's a real kind of embedding in our culture of Johnnie Walker, which actually, if you've grown up in the UK, you might not have seen, you might not have experienced. But it is, and it's why actually, out of all the brands that Diageo could have to sponsor the F1, it's Johnnie Walker that they use, because it really is the global brand that has that reach and has that reach of luxury. So if you do have some handy, pour a little out, and we'll have I'll talk you through a little nosing of it. There's a couple of other things in that history which I'm just going to dwell on for another little sec. So he mentioned as well the shape of the bottle, the square bottle. So that was pretty revolutionary back then. That was just down to the fact that they were literally shipping to 120 countries before Coca-Cola had even got out of bed. So like when we talk about like original global brands, Johnnie Walker is certainly up there. And the square bottle was designed to prevent breakages and to have more bottles per shipment. And then the other thing that I just thought was very clever was the label, the idea that the label is exactly 23 degrees. And the reason for that is because if you have a slanted label, you can make the typeface bigger and it makes it more recognizable on the back of the bar, which I think is very clever too. And then the striding man. And the striding man really sums up the brand pretty well. So the striding man walking, in fact, the original striding man, if you can find like a really old vintage bottle, you'll actually find that the man walks the other way. There's a little, if you're into your vintage spirits, you could have a look for that personally. But he got turned round because actually that striding man is there to signify progress and modernity, like the modern world and progress is really what the brand's all about. So again, if you go online, you have a look, you'll see that they're experimenting with paper bottles, refillable bottles. So not standing on their laurels of being kind of pioneers in the past, but also trying to pioneer those changes in the future as well. So if you've got some in front of you, have a little nose. Again, in the video, and I'm not sure if anyone can remember this, pop it in chat. They bought a distillery. It was really famed at the time, and it's always described by blenders as being silky, silk-like, this particular distillery. And that distillery is the lead malt in Johnnie Walker Black Label. Can anyone remember what it was called? Cardew, very good. Yeah, Cardew. Again, not a malt that you'll find here in the UK. The majority of it sold as Cardew is sold in Spain, so you won't usually see it. But that is the lead malt in Johnnie Walker Black Label. It's about 40% of the blend, and then the other 60% of the blend is made up of about 40 other whiskies. Now, Diageo only own, I think it's 27 only, 27 Scotch whisky distilleries. So that obviously means that they buy, swap, barter with other companies as well to get the right flavors, the right paints, if you like, that they need in order to paint on that Cardew, which is almost like the canvas on what those other flavors are built upon. Again, just before we taste, I've got no idea what people think about Scotch whisky on the calls. So I think it's worth kind of just mentioning that often our guests that come in, they often have a ill-conceived idea around single malts and blends. This is a blend. They often, like, there's almost like a hierarchy with single malts at the top and blends at the bottom. I would say it couldn't be further from the truth. And actually, I've worked on Johnnie Walker for long enough, and I've done blind tastings long enough to have a little bit of fun with those consumers. So whenever I've done blind tastings, I usually include Johnnie Walker Black Label somewhere in the blind tasting. And people will wax lyrical about the malts that they're trying. But when you get to the end of the tasting, it almost always either wins or is in the top 3 for most people as their favorite. And you know, you can look it up in books, you can look it up for whiskey writers. It's often been described as the Everest of whiskey, Scotch whiskey. It's almost like a benchmark that you can compare other whiskies to. It is really good. So within this, then really there's 4 key flavors. So if you do have any in front of you, get your nose in, have a little smell. There is a smokiness to it. We have access to John Walker's original purchasing books, his logs from the greengrocer. Diageo they have their own archive up in Scotland, where all of this stuff sits. So when they're doing like new product development, they'll consult the original kind of blending books that they wrote. That all sits up in the archive. But what you see when you look at what malt whiskies he was buying in really early, there was always a good proportion of those from the West Coast. And if you know Scotland and whiskey fairly well, you know West Coast whiskies tend to be smoky. It's something to do probably with not being able to get coal over the hills, so people burned peat, and it would be natural to burn peat over there. So with all of the Walkers, you will find smoke, okay, and it doesn't shy behind it. So there's definitely smoke there. The other thing that you'll probably pick out is fruit, and there's probably two sides to it. There's almost like an orchard fruit, so it could be like apple or pear potentially. And then on the kind of richer side, you probably get some dried fruit too. So whether that's like cherry or raisins, or more broadly, more kind of Christmas cake or Dundee cake kind of aromas. What's interesting about mentioning both of those as well, if you were making a single malt, you probably wouldn't ever get that. You wouldn't ever get fresh and dried fruits. It would be fresh fruits or dried fruits. You wouldn't get a single malt being able to do both. And I think that's where blending comes into its own, that it can take these individual parts and paint a landscape, if you like, a flavor landscape that is way bigger and way broader than you would ever get from a single malt on its own. It's not to say single malts are inferior either, because it's almost like they're one note on a piano, or maybe one chord on a piano, whereas a blend is a tune or a bigger chord, potentially. Does that make sense? Yeah. Cool. Okay. So yeah, so I think you've got this smoke, fresh fruit, dried fruit. And then the last bit, which is probably the wood, is vanilla. And it's almost like a creamy vanilla, almost like an ice cream vanilla. Have a taste. Feel free to spit. And again, that silky smoothness of the Cardew really comes through. Very tasty, very chewable. The length's great. So that's Johnnie Walker Black. I am conscious as well, some of the properties have Johnnie Walker Blue. I'm not rich enough to have Johnnie Walker Blue here to taste. Maybe you guys aren't either, but I'll give you a bit of a heads up on it. So whilst this is 12, where are we? You're in my smoke. If you've got it in front of you, I'm sure you can see it. So there's a 12. The 12, obviously, with Scotch whiskey denotes the youngest whiskey used in the blend. So that's 12 years. Interestingly, thanks for your question. I'll answer that in a sec. Interestingly, the blue label, if you look for an age statement on blue label, you're not going to find it. And I kind of want to give you a bit of an inside scoop as to why. Okay. Blue label is literally a blend of the oldest and rarest whiskies that Johnnie Walker can lay their hands on. Now, this archive of whiskey, and it really is. I mean, I've flown over it, and I'm saying that to try and give you a sense of the vastness of barrels aging in Scotland that will at one point be Johnnie Walker. The volume is so high. I remember at one time when they valued it more than the gold reserves for the Bank of England when we had a gold reserve. Like a lot of whiskey waiting to be Johnnie Walker. Now, if you take whiskies that are 40, 50, 60, 70, maybe even 80 years old, okay, what you will get is you'll get intense complexity, but what you will also lose is vibrancy. So the reason there's no age statement on blue label is because it will need something young to wake it up. And it will be incredibly confusing to a consumer, because you either leave the age statement off or you say what the youngest whiskey is in the blend. Even if it's just a tiny amount, you have to say what the youngest is. So even though you've got this blend of literally the oldest and rarest whiskies that Johnnie Walker have, if you put a 12-year-old whiskey in there to lift it and just wake all those kind of complex flavors up, you'd have to put 12-year-old on the bottle. So what they do is they leave that off. And obviously, because you're using whiskies that are so old and so rare, we run out of them. So you have to use something else. So the blender, and it really is an art. It's not a science. Like, it really is an art. The blender has to be able to get to the same flavor in a different way. So again, the age statement, leaving the age statement off there is just a way to give them that flexibility to always achieve a consistent product, when each year the paint, you make the same picture, but the paints that you have to paint with change a little bit. So that's pretty much it for me. There was a quick question in there about Green Label. Green Label is still available in other markets. I'm not sure if it's one that you guys stock. But yeah, that was a blended malt, so no grain. No grain whiskey in there. But yeah, not available here, but is available in other markets. Just very quickly, does anyone have any burning questions that they'd like to ask? You can pop them in chat, or you can fire them straight at me if you like. Silence is killing me. I'll assume that there's no questions. Just to finish off then on that last question, just because you've asked, and I know it's not part of your stocking policy, but for Green Label is just made of, it's Talisker, Cragganmore, Linkwood and Kalila. So it's those 4 malts blended together, and that's Green Label. Oh, actually, the lead malt in blue is a very, very old Royal Lochnagar. So where the lead malt in Black Label is Cardew, the lead malt in Blue Label is Royal Lochnagar, a very old one. Cool. Okay. Well, look. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. Hopefully that was what you needed. It would be great to hear some feedback at some point if we do these again. But yeah, thanks for having me. Cheers.
Thanks, Matt. Very much appreciated. Can you guys hear me okay? Matt, 1, 2.
Yeah, can hear you.
We can hear you.
Oh, we can't now.
What about now? Yeah, cool, brilliant. Okay, Matt, thank you so much for your time, guys. Hope that was useful. Covering 2 of our kind of key brands from Diageo. I've just got the planner on screen here, so as you can see, next session is on Monday, Rittenhouse Rye, and there's sessions all next week, right through to the end of the month. So look forward to hopefully you guys joining us next week. But yeah, thanks again to Matt, and have a great weekend. I'll finish the call there. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.